It is one of the world's most famous, influential, and creepy children's books. A 200 years old, 30-page German picture book that on one hand revolutionized children's fiction forever, but on the other haunted countless nightmares, and represents the education ideology that some claim brought to the rise of Nazi Germany. Hi, and welcome to All That Is Dark, where we take an intellectual dive into the darker corners of human culture and psychology. Shock-Headed Peter, or in the original German name, Struwwelpeter, was written in 1845 by German psychiatrist Heinrich Hoffmann. Toasty! Even today, nearly 200 years and 600 editions after it was first published, the book's enormous success and influence can't be ignored. With countless references and adaptations stretching from the Tiger Lilies and Rammstein through Tim Burton, Looney Tunes, and even Family Guy, the book is still a milestone of Western culture and art. Maurice Sendak, one of the most renowned children's books writers and illustrators of all times, said that, graphically, it is one of the most beautiful books in the world. And although you can't ignore the book's influence and popularity, you also can't ignore the fact that it contains horrific stories for children, such as a girl burning to death for playing with matches, a boy starving to death for not eating his soup, and a child whose thumbs get cut off by a giant pair of scissors because he sucked on them. To understand this contradiction between the book's fabulous execution and its problematic message, to say the least, we should take a closer look at the time and context in which it was written. Hoffmann initially wrote the book as a gift for his 3-year-old son. He did that because, by his own words, he could not find any children's books that he thought were appropriate for a child this age. This is how Hoffmann himself described his frustration with the children's books of the time. On Christmas week of 1844, I went out to the stores of Frankfurt to buy a present for my 3-year-old son. I wished for a picture book for him to enjoy, but what have I found on the shelves? Long, foolish and boring tales, silly drawings, moral lessons that begin and end with preaching and rebuke such as, "The good boy speaks the truth," "Children must keep clean," and so on. The further I looked into these books, the more impatient I grew. Children do not improve their behavior by abstract talks. One fairy tale will influence them more than 1,000 warnings. So Hoffmann went ahead and created 10 sensational, action-packed short stories illustrated with big, colorful drawings. At the center of each tale stood a misbehaving child. Robert sets out to the storm in spite of his parents' warnings. Philip can't sit still at the dinner table, and so on and so forth. Hoffmann then gathered these 10 stories into a single book and named it after one of the main characters, Shock-Headed Peter, the slovenly boy who wouldn't shower, cut his hair, or trim his nails. Some of Hoffmann's friends persuaded him to publish the book, and it was an immediate bestseller. Children were captivated by this fresh approach that perhaps for the first time in history of books put their desires and needs in the center. That is why, to this day, Shock-Headed Peter is often considered as the book that first defined children's literature as we know it today. However, while the content of the book was a total breath of fresh air, in terms of its pedagogical value, it did not bring anything new to the table. The educational message of Struwwelpeter was in accordance with the prevailing one in 19th century Germany: behave or else. In its core, Shock-Headed Peter leaned on the same principles that shaped German child-rearing in the previous centuries. These principles utilized fear, violence, and manipulation as legitimate means in breaking the will of the child and subjugating it to that of the parent. German educational manuals of the time were filled with suggestions like, "Just as soon as children develop awareness, it is essential to demonstrate to them by word and deed that they must submit to the will of their parents. Your son is trying to usurp your authority, and you are justified in answering force with force in order to ensure his respect, without which you will be unable to train him. The blows you administer should not be merely playful ones, but should convince him that you are his master." A very good exercise in the art of self-denial is to watch other people in his immediate vicinity eating and drinking without desiring the same for himself. These manuals also reassured parents using these methods that These first years have the advantage that one can use force and compulsion. With age, children forget everything that encountered in their early childhood. Thus, if one can take away children's will, they will not remember afterward that they had a will. So, when Casper refuses to eat his soup, his off-screen parents did not give him anything else. Instead, they try to break him. Every day he gets the same soup, becoming thinner and weaker, and on the 5th day, he dies. And when little Paulina's parents leave her home alone with 2 cats and a box of matches, resulting in her playing with them and burning to death, that is not considered as a problem of parental irresponsibility, but as a problem of bad behavior and lack of discipline. Criticism of problematic messages in children's books refers to works even older than Shock-Headed Peter. Perhaps the most notable of them is the Grimm brothers' fairy tales, also a German creation. Stories in which grannies are eaten alive, maidens are being poisoned, and children are locked and prepared for cooking are regarded by many educators today as inappropriate for children. However, there is one major difference between the Grimm brothers and Struwwelpeter. In the fairy tales, there is an evil monster that should be feared and beware of. In Hoffmann's story, evil is the child. If the Grimm brothers' fairy tales teach children anything, at least those of them that are still famous today, it is that evil can be triumphed, even by children, as in the case of Hansel and Gretel. They teach children that the world is just, and those who are evil and wish harm to others will be punished. The Wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, the Evil Witch in Snow White, and the Maid in the Goose Girl, to name a few. But in Shock-Headed Peter, children are taught that they are the evil that must be triumphed. You can hardly imagine a child who hadn't committed at least one of the crimes depicted in the book, sucking on a thumb or not wanting to eat your greens. In Hoffmann's stories, these evil, misbehaved children are the ones constantly being punished in the most gruesome of ways. All these techniques of threat, violence, and emotional abuse to keep children in line, to which Shock-Headed Peter has also contributed, are nowadays referred to as black pedagogy, a term coined by, surprise surprise, German educationalist Katerina Rutschke. Rutschke concludes that the root of black pedagogy is the idea that disobedient children have seeds of evil in them that must be uprooted for the child to be a functioning, well-mannered adult. For that end, the parent or teacher can and should use any means necessary. In that sense, Struwwelpeter followed its predecessors to the letter. The stories in the book literally terrorize children into behaving and obeying, and make it clear that the consequences of failing to do so may be
severe.
Unfortunately, violence and abuse against children are still with us today, and they exist in every culture around the world. But in 19th century Germany, it was not considered abuse at all, but simply the proper way to raise a child. According to historical and social research, most, if not all, children in 19th century Germany would, today, be considered abused children. And such an epidemic of abuse, a tragedy of an entire nation, was bound to have very grave consequences when these children became adults. The idea of black pedagogy was further developed by American-Swiss psychologist Alice Miller. She theorized that the toxic culture of child rearing has caused a cycle of violence that carried on through generations and eventually enabled the rise of the Third Reich. That was because fear and contempt of disobedience were so deeply ingrained in the mind of the German population that rallying behind a powerful, just leader with no questions asked simply was the natural thing to do. Here's another excerpt from a German educational manual from the 1850s. Both Hitler, who was born in 1889, and most of his electorate were educated in this spirit. One of the vile products is the idea that in order to obey gladly, the child has to understand the reasons why an order is given, and that blind obedience offends human dignity. Whoever presumes so forgets that our faith requires us adults to bow to the higher wisdom of divine providence. I do not know how we can continue to speak of obedience once reasons are given. These are meant to convince the child, and, once convinced, he is not obeying us, but merely the reasons we have given him. Respect for a higher intelligence is then replaced by a self-satisfied allegiance to his own cleverness. Anyone who believes he can win love only if he is obeyed as a result of explanations is sorely mistaken, for he fails to recognize the nature of the child and his need to submit to someone stronger than himself. And here's an excerpt from a speech given by Rudolf Hess, one of the most senior members in the Nazi hierarchy and Hitler's official second-in-command. We note with pride that one man remains beyond all criticism, and that is the Führer. This is because everyone senses and knows he is always right and he will always be right. The National Socialism of us all is anchored in uncritical loyalty, in a surrender to the Führer that does not ask about why in individual cases, but in the silent execution of his orders. We believe that the Führer is obeying a higher call to shape German history. There can be no criticism of this belief. This twisted relationship between children and adults, masters and subordinates, was, according to Miller, what allowed the Nationalist Socialist Party to sweep across German politics and to lead millions of normative, seemingly moral men and women to some of the greatest atrocities in human history. Getting back to Shockheaded Peter, I'm obviously not suggesting that this 30-page book is the reason for Nazi Germany, only a reflection of the ideas that set the ground for it to emerge. But according to Miller, obedience itself was only one factor of past German mentality to allow the horrors of Nazi Germany to happen. She continues to make a connection between the mental world of an abused child and that of an abusive adult. She cites a study that described the behavior of abused children, which, given in that context of the adults they eventually grew up to be, chills the blood. The children were almost completely unable to express anger and aggression toward adults. Their stories and games, on the other hand, were full of aggression and brutality. Dolls and fictitious persons were constantly being beaten, tormented, and killed. Many children repeated their own abuse in their play. One child, whose skull had been broken 3 times as an infant, always made stories about people or animals who suffered head injuries. Another child, whose mother had attempted to drown when he was a baby, began the play therapy by drowning a doll in the bathtub, and then having the police take the mother to prison. Although these real-life events played little part in the children's openly expressed fears, they were the basis of a strong unconscious preoccupation. The children were almost never able to express their anxieties verbally, yet they harbored intense feelings of rage and a strong desire for revenge. These abused children, when turning adults, Miller says, have found the projection for their violent urges of revenge in the shape of Jews, gypsies, gays, people with disabilities, and all those who have been outcast by the German regime. This relationship between obedience, education, and abuse sheds some light on the blatant contradiction between the civility of the Nazi German, who had great affection and appreciation of art, manners, and culture, and the inhumane brutality and violence with which they treated their victims. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.